My presentation today will be on the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, which occurred between 175 and 164 BCE. To start, I wanted to talk about my sources. There is 4 Greek and Latin sources that I made use of. Polybius is the best source from the Greek and Latin sources because he was alive during the time of Antiochus IV. He was originally a Greek cavalry officer who was one of 1,000 elites deported to Rome because of distrust. He ended up becoming a tutor while in Rome for a Roman elite, which allowed him to befriend both Scipio Africanus and King Demetrius I. Scipio Africanus was the commander who led the Roman forces against Antiochus's father, Antiochus III. And King Demetrius I ended up being the successor after Antiochus to the throne of the Seleucids. He was a son of Seleucus who was later exchanged for Antiochus in a trade. Now, Polybius's history was intended to describe the constitution and growth of Rome so that the Greeks would understand what they were up against. Polybius is generally regarded as a critical historian because he was passionate about recording an accurate account. Antiochus IV was not the only story of concern for Polybius, so his history tends to weave in and out of the affairs of Antiochus. The other 3 historians that I have on this list is Diodorus Siculus, Livy, and Appian, and each of these were Roman writers who were from a much later period. Their works tend to take a number of points from the account of Polybius. They will at times add small details here or there, but those additions are probably changes made to dress up the story. None of these 4 accounts address the Jewish story. They tend to focus on the ascension of Antiochus, his campaigns into Egypt, his festival on Daphne, and his death. There are 3 Jewish sources which address the reign of Antiochus. 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and then Josephus. Josephus touches on the reign of Antiochus in 2 of his writings, the first being the Jewish War, which is the earlier and the shorter account, and then the Antiquity of the Jews. Josephus tends to use 1st Maccabees as a source, but he will add his own comments from time to time, as well as details from other accounts. 1st and 2nd Maccabees are thought to have been written shortly after the death of Antiochus, while Josephus was written a couple hundred years later. These accounts tend to focus upon the Antiochian invasions of Jerusalem, as well as his decree to outlaw their laws. They will correlate these events to his Egyptian campaigns. These accounts also detail how Antiochus dealt with the Maccabean revolt, as well as detail his death. 1st Maccabees is a good source for dating events, and among these writings, there are a few different variations on Antiochus's death. My paper also looked at some additional sources outside of the written accounts. The Babylonian king list and Egyptian papyri both provide information regarding dating. The Babylonian astronomical diaries also provides dating information, but it connects the dates to a few different events within his reign, including a festival after invading Egypt, a campaign into Armenia, and his death. Coinage provides information regarding his association with various gods, and also gives corroboration of a period where Antiochus shared the throne with a son of Seleucus IV. This is a timeline of Antiochus's reign. When he was young, he was a Roman captive who was taken during the submission of his father. Prior to his death, Seleucus IV exchanged his son Demetrius for Antiochus. Around the time of the exchange, Seleucus was assassinated, but Antiochus was able to regain the throne with the help of Eumenes and Attalus, who were leaders of one of the islands in the Mediterranean. Both the Babylonian king list and coinage suggest that Antiochus had a co-regency for a time, with a younger son of Seleucus. But 5 years into his reign, Antiochus had the boy killed. Now, early in his reign, before ever invading Egypt, The Jewish sources tell of Antiochus's involvement with the high priesthood of Jerusalem. He first begins by deposing the current high priest and replacing him with Jason, who is one who is willing to up the taxes if Antiochus would support his claim. Now, Jason is said to be a Greek sympathizer who is hoping to convert the city towards the ways of the Greeks. Now, after a time, Antiochus would grow irritated with Jason, and he replaced him with Menelaus, who was also wanting to pay money to take on the role of high priest. Now, Menelaus was hated quite a bit more by the people, and he ended up causing a bunch of intrigue around the city. Now, this is all just sort of relayed as a preamble leading into the Egyptian campaigns. Now, Antiochus had 2 invasions into Egypt. When he invaded the first time, there were multiple leaders of Egypt. Antiochus took Pelusium, and while he had Alexandria under siege, he made an agreement with his nephew Ptolemy Philometor to take control of the region. A couple years later, the Ptolemies banded together again, and Antiochus invaded once again. This second time, he was met by a Roman emissary. Now, there is some debate with the sources whether Antiochus invaded Jerusalem once or twice. If he went with twice, it would mean that he did it both times when returning from Egypt. But it's more likely that he only did it the second time. So when he returned from Egypt the second time, he was angry about what the Roman emissary had made him agree to. And on his return, he heard word that there had been an uprising in Jerusalem. Apparently, while he was in Egypt, Jason had taken advantage of his departure and had a group of people supporting him that ended up overthrowing Menelaus. Now, when Antiochus heard of this, he decided he had enough and he was going to storm into the city with his forces, which they did. They invaded into Egypt and they killed a bunch of people, and he ended up stealing a number of treasures from the temple. Now, as the story goes, he left Jerusalem and went back to Antioch. Now, sometime later, he sends one of his commanders with a force back to Jerusalem. Now, apparently, these forces were welcomed into the city. But once these forces got into the city, they turned hostile. They ended up killing a ton of different people, and they went on to defile the temple and install a ongoing force within the citadel that had been built within the city. And the citadel is basically a fortress. So when they defiled the temple, they ended up making a sacrifice on the altar, and this was seen as an abomination to the people. Now, shortly after this, Antiochus sent a decree to the city, basically outlawing the worship of Jerusalem's fathers' gods. And the people, I guess some of them accepted this, but there was some who just couldn't stand for this, and they end up starting a resistance against the forces of Antiochus. So Antiochus wasn't involved in the fight against this resistance at first. He ends up delegating the fight to a number of different commanders who, in successive battles, end up losing to the forces of the Maccabeans, who were led by Judas Maccabeus. Eventually, word of these defeats would make their way back to Antiochus, but this wouldn't happen for some time. Now, in the meantime, the Greek and Roman sources tell of a huge festival that was held in the city of Daphne. And this was to occur around 166 BC. So it's likely that this was happening during the time that the revolt was going on in Judah. Now, at these games of Daphne, it was an extravagant affair where Antiochus had spared no expense, the thought being that he was trying to show up a Roman Roman elite by just the extravagance of this. And in the accounts of this festival, it's often made comments that Antiochus was really an odd leader. At times, he would have all this magnificence, and he seemed to really be elevated in his affairs, but at the same time, he would present himself in a very unkingly manner. So in this particular occasion, he is seen walking alongside the procession of this festival, riding on just a terrible horse, looking like just some sort of scraggler who just wandered into the place. So they often say they've never seen a leader quite like Antiochus, who at times could be so extravagant and other times be so base. And this is just sort of a little glimpse we get into the personality of Antiochus. Now, some of these Babylonian records make mention of a campaign into Armenia, which happened about a year later. And then shortly after that time must be when he decided to head off on a campaign into Persia. Now, it's said that prior to this campaign to Persia, Antiochus receives word of the defeats of his two forces that had been sent down to fight against the Maccabeans. And Antiochus gets really upset by this and calls all his army together. Now, after he does so, he realizes that they're short on funds, and it is this point that he decides that they better make a campaign into Persia to collect taxes. So what he does is he divides his army up into two portions. He takes half and goes off into Persia, and the other half he puts under one of his commanders who continues the battle against the Maccabeans. So the story of Antiochus heads off into Persia at this point. Now, when he gets into Persia, he decides that he is going to raid a temple in Elymais. And this is where the different sources tend to diverge in their telling of the story. One, I think in Second Maccabees, tells that he was actually killed while within the temple, but three other sources tell of his death occurring after being repelled from his raid on the temple. Now, Polybius actually says afterwards he dies in another city in Persia after being repelled from the city, and he credits this death to the great offense that he had made against the god Artemis of this temple in Elymais. Now, the Jewish sources don't think this is feasible, and Josephus actually reveals his logic on the subject. He actually responds to Polybius' account and says, "It makes no sense to me that Antiochus would be struck down because of his failed attempt to rob the temple in Elymais. What makes much more sense to me is that he died because of the awful things he had done in the temple in Jerusalem. Because why would a god kill you for something you weren't able to do rather than something that you did do?" So to me, there's a certain amount of logic to this argument, and it sort of makes sense. But ultimately, how Antiochus died and what the divine reasoning was behind this, we really have no way of telling, and history isn't going to be able to answer that question for us. So it's sort of left to the individual to decide what they think is preferable. Now, until this point, I haven't talked about the Daniel passage. And the reason I chose not to do that is because there really is not much specificity within the text of Daniel. So I didn't want to use it for the reconstruction. But I thought once I did have a reconstruction put together, it would be good to go back and compare against the text to see how much it correlated with the story that I had reconstructed. So the text referring to Antiochus IV starts in verse 21. Now, commentators tend to diverge with regards to how much of the remaining text of Daniel references Antiochus. Jerome saw a divergence right at verse 21, while some see all the remaining verses, right up to verse 45, being related to Antiochus. Now, even Jerome would admit that Antiochus could fit the description, but only as a type, because Jerome was convinced that Rome during the New Testament time was a better fit to the narrative. Now verses 25 and 26, which is up on the screen, tend to describe the first invasion into Egypt where Antiochus made an agreement with his nephew. When we jump ahead to verses 29 and 30, this is thought to refer to the second invasion into Egypt. The ships of Kittim are thought to represent the Roman emissary who met Antiochus and demanded that he state his intentions. In doing so, he handed him a letter from Rome and drew a circle around him in the sand. He told him that he had until the time he left the circle to state whether he intended to declare war against Rome or to turn back. Now verse 30 talks about him returning in anger and taking action against the Holy Covenant. This is thought to be the invasion of Jerusalem and ultimately his decree to outlaw the practice of their laws. Verses 31 and 32 make reference to the forces he sent to Jerusalem to invade the city. Some of the accounts mention that after Antiochus had initially invaded Jerusalem, he left afterwards for Antioch, which I had mentioned earlier. A little later, he sent a commander with forces to take Jerusalem by intrigue. The people welcomed them in, but once they got there, they began to kill many people. They went on to defile the temple, make sacrifices on the altar, and then eventually give Antiochus' decree to outlaw the religious practices. This final action triggers a revolt. This revolt is hinted to in verse 32. Verses 33 to 36 start to allude to the Maccabean revolt. This revolt would go on for a few years. They eventually retake Jerusalem and resume the sacrifices at the temple, but this would not be until 3 years after the time that it was originally defiled. I believe that the second half of verse 36 is where the story in Daniel 11 starts to diverge from the events of Antiochus' life. You will notice within the text here that there are no signs indicating that there is a change of focus within the writer. The pronouns still seem to be pointing to the same character as before. Verses 36 and 37 suggest that the person of interest would show no regard for the God of his fathers, or any God at all. I added pictures of 2 coins on the slide, the top one depicting Zeus and the lower one depicting Apollo. Apollo was the god generally associated with the Seleucids, and Zeus was the god that Antiochus exalted during his Egyptian campaigns. It is suggested that Zeus was a god worshipped by the Egyptians, so there was some degree of propaganda involved here. Accounts of the festival in Daphne also tell of all sorts of gods being exalted during the festival. All these tend to suggest that Antiochus did regard the gods, so this is my reasoning for seeing a break with the Daniel text. The final 2 verses of Daniel 11 talk about the death of the person in focus. The beginning of these verses speak of reports from the east which would correlate well with his eventual campaign into Persia, but the location of the death does not agree. There are multiple accounts of Antiochus' death, but common to each of the accounts is that he died in Persia, sometime after attempting a raid of a temple. These verses in Daniel suggest that he died between the Holy Mountain and the sea. Because of this divergence in the text, some commentators call the account a quasi-history. They suggest that until verse 36, the writer is looking back on historical events. The events beyond the point are speculative. They use this to suggest that the writing was authored around 165 BCE, shortly before the death of Antiochus. I think this option makes more sense than the 2 alternatives. One alternative is that this is a 6th century writing that got much of the prophecy right, but then erred towards the end. The other view is that this was a 6th century writing which got much of the account right, and then at verse 36 telescopes forward into the future. I personally think that the quasi-history is preferable out of these 3 options. If I am right in this preference, then Daniel 10 takes on a new light. If you recall from my previous presentation, this historical account is a part of a vision which takes up the final 3 chapters of Daniel. Prior to the angel telling of these historic events, he tells Daniel that he had been obstructed from visiting him for 3 weeks by the prince of Persia. Many will point to this verse as a proof of spirits in opposition to God. If this is seen as a 2nd century writing, then the encounter between Daniel and the angel may never have happened. If the meeting never happened, then this passage isn't as convincing as a proof text for a spirit war. So this concludes my presentation.